Generally speaking, up until the mid-1950s, the opening titles of movies were relatively simple affairs. The title card, a cast list, and some of the most important credits, all of which took up less than a minute of screen time. Then the director Otto Preminger brought in a graphic designer to spice things up for his films Carmen Jones and The Man with the Golden Arm. This designer, Saul Bass, would quickly and permanently change the game by turning the opening credits into an art form all its own. Not content with just revolutionizing how movies are made, though, Bass wanted to direct. When Alfred Hitchcock hired him to work on the opening titles for Psycho, Bass also helped storyboard the famous shower scene, though how much his visualization made it into the final film is a subject of venomous debate among film historians. I'm not going to get into it. Nevertheless, Bass did direct key sequences in films like West Side Story and Spartacus before making his own short films with his wife Elaine. In 1968, the pair even earned an Academy Award for their short film Why Man Creates. Bass also did some work on television commercials, but he knew he wanted to direct a full-length feature. You can imagine his reaction when a Hollywood producer called him up one day and asked, "What would you say to making a movie about ants?"
Think of their ability to evolve and adapt in ways that are so beautiful.
After an unprecedented solar event, the ants have begun to change. Setting aside intercolonial domination in favor of collaboration, ants of different species out in the Arizona desert have developed a hive mind, destroyed all their natural predators, built bizarre monuments in the sand, and have even exerted their will over the local human population. One scientist, Dr. Hubbs, foresees a coming battle for survival, and he sets out with mathematical theorist James Lesko to study their behavior and find a way to defeat them before it is too late. However, after taking in the sole survivor of a brutal attack on a farm, they find themselves under siege by the unlikeliest of enemies and contemplating the very real possibility that they might just be outmatched by the ants.
It was over cocktails when a Paramount executive asked the producer Paul B. Radine, well known for Born Free and its sequel Living Free, what he was working on. Thinking fast because he didn't have any answer other than nothing, Radine answered that he was thinking about making an ant movie. This seemed like a relatively safe bet in Hollywood, which had seen its fair share of successful ant movies like Them and The Naked Jungle. And so Radine suddenly found himself tied to the idea. Later, he called up Saul Bass, who apparently had a friend who knew a thing or two about the hive-minded little buggers, and Bass agreed to direct the movie Radine had just invented on the spot. Bass's Why We Create co-writer, Mayo Simon, came up with a story and screenplay, which was likely inspired by both H.G. Wells's Empire of the Ants and the 1971 mockumentary The Hellstrom Chronicle, the latter of which not only dealt with the idea of insects winning the evolutionary arms race against humans, but also featured state-of-the-art live-action insect photography by Ken Middleham. Middleham was then brought in to do the same kind of work on Bass's film, which had the working title Phase 2, but would later become known as Phase 4. Given the film's low budget, when it came to casting, Bass opted for smaller names. To play the male lead of James Lesko, they cast Robert Altman fixture Michael Murphy, who is nowadays most recognized for appearing in things like White House Down and X-Men The Last Stand.
Don't do this. I only wanted to help you people.
Do we look like we need your help?
However, He is greatly outshone in Phase 4 by Nigel Davenport, who plays the Captain Ahab-esque Dr. Hubbs. Davenport wasn't an unknown by any stretch. He'd appeared in A Man for All Seasons, Mary Queen of Scots, and the aforementioned Living Free, but he wasn't exactly a huge draw either. It was Davenport who recommended his No Blade of Grass co-star Lynn Frederick to play the young Kendra. At 20 years old, Frederick, who had previously appeared in Nicholas and Alexandra and Hammer's Vampire Circus, and who had beaten out Linda Blair for the part, was forced to stick to a miserly diet of chicken broth and black coffee and wear a metal-clad corset in order to make her look even younger, because her character was supposed to be 16. Bass also had her practice her lines to an almost excessive degree in order to iron out her British accent.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
What do you do here?
The minor roles are filled by Alan Gifford, who 2001 fans might recognize as Poole's dad,
See you next Wednesday.
and Helen Horton, who would later voice Mother in Alien, as well as appear in Superman 3, along with Robert Henderson, who has a blink-and-you'll-miss-it role in Phase 4 as Cleet. And believe it or not, that's the entire cast, outside of an uncredited David Healy, who is the voice on the radio.
You might get an interesting reaction.
Filming began in early 1973, primarily at Pinewood Studios in England, but with location shooting done in Kenya, which stood in for the Arizona desert. Bass refused to use typical fake button and light panels to represent computers, and instead brought in real computer equipment, including an Elliott 903 and a GEC 4080, not that I actually know what those are. The music was done by multiple people, with the score composed by Brian Gascoigne, a bunch of electronic music created by David Vorhaus and Desmond Briscoe, and the climactic montage music made by Tsutomu Yamashita, who is credited in the film, even though his montage isn't in the final film. That's because Saul Bass, as a first-time director, didn't have Final Cut approval, and the climax, which is reminiscent of 2001 A Space Odyssey's trippy final act, didn't suit the tastes of Paramount executives, who had already expended their political capital ensuring that the film received a PG rating instead of the R that the MPAA originally wanted to give it. The removed sequence was long thought to be lost, but it resurfaced in recent years, finally made its way onto the film's Blu-ray releases, and can now be found in its entirety here on YouTube. Saul Bass also had no control over the marketing and release of the film. He didn't even get to design the poster, even though he designed some of the most famous movie posters of all time. Paramount tried to sell Phase 4 as a killer ant movie, and made a sensationalist poster that claimed ants were going to be seen taking over the world. Therefore, when the movie released in September of 1974, audiences who went in expecting another Them were no doubt disappointed to sit through a meditative, intellectual sci-fi film with art house sensibilities. Even critics didn't like it at the time, complaining that the narrative didn't work, the ending was confusing, and the characters were inscrutable.
I don't have the faintest idea what it means.
A few even complained about the lack of a romantic subplot between the male and female leads, even though, again, Kendra is supposed to be 16. In other words, the movie was a certified flop, and Saul Bass would never get the chance to direct another feature film in its wake. However, it has developed a cult following over the years and has gotten a glowing critical reappraisal by film historians and academics, who now seem to be nearly unanimous in their praise of Bass's vision and artistic style. And personally, I tend to agree. It is a visual treat of a movie, not just because of Ken Middleham's incredible ant sequences, to this day they're so good it's hard to believe they're 100% real, but also because of Saul Bass's use of framing, color, and sound. I'll grant that the narrative is a bit underwhelming, and I don't know how much I can jive with a theme that essentially boils down to a subversive argument against individualism, but the underlying horror and tension are powerful. I love how our protagonist, James, is struggling to communicate and understand not just the ants, but also his increasingly unhinged colleague. And I like how we are invited to view the film through the same lens as Kendra, who spends the majority of it in a state of bewildered shock. Now, whenever I cover a more artsy movie like The Man Who Fell to Earth, Solaris, or most recently Nothing Lasts Forever, I inevitably have to disclaim that this isn't a movie for everyone, which is probably why it failed to truly find its audience until decades after it was made. However, I think this is more generally accessible than those others, and as long as you don't go in expecting a thrilling killer insect flick where humans prove their superiority with intelligence and a side of ginormous explosions, I'd recommend giving it a shot. It's a great film that deserved much better than it got in its day, and that's why, in my eyes, it remains a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What's your favorite movie about insects? Let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, don't forget to squash those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll set a classic adventure novel on a planetary neighbor, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Did you actually succeed in making positive contact with the whales?
Only with the emotionally disturbed.